And I just wanted to touch on the importance of why I'm so passionate about creating diverse and inclusive environments, because they do benefit all. So research has found that organizations with high level of diversity have less turnover, more professionals with job satisfaction, and it's actually more profitable for organizations when you are really looking at kind of critical decision making and you have diverse people in there, you're making better decisions as a department and organization. So I always say that we all have a part to play in creating inclusion in the workplace. So I'll just go straight into my next slide to touch a bit more on neurodiversity and neurodivergent. These are terms I think people are definitely becoming more familiar with for the last few years. So just to really touch on their background and where the term kind of originates from. It was coined in the late 1990s, and it's given it's a name that's given to a range of brain functions in the human population. So often a common misconception is that neurodivergent mind isn't normal, and there are always terms I try and move past. The reality is there is no normal, and when it comes to how our brain works, everyone's mind functions differently. But neurodiversity is really that concept that the brain differences and natural variations refer to different ways people's brain works and interprets information. And the reason why it's so important to have these conversations and really hear people's neurodivergent experiences is that at least 20% of the UK adult population are neurodivergent. A lot of people may not even know that they're neurodivergent. And it covers a range of conditions such as autism, dyslexia, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyspraxia, OCD, and Tourette's, just to name a few. And HR Grapevine published statistics that said they believe their workplace has at least 16% of people who are neurodivergent. And it's why it's so important to have these conversations in the spotlight. And I always say that another reason why I think is important, and people need to realize that neurodivergent conditions are protected under the Equality Act 2010. So it is important that we are really making sure we're exploring and supporting all people's different experiences in the workplace, and it is a protected characteristic. So people do have the right to be protected and making sure that they're getting to be fully supported in the workplace. And then the next slide is just talking about the makeup of neurodiversity. So if you can go into that next slide for me, Joe, brilliant. And yeah, so I touched on a bit. Here's a lot more of some of the makeup of these different neurodivergent conditions. So we have dyspraxia on here, can lead to difficulties with planning, movements, coordination, and practical tasks, as well as influence things such as tracking and balance, poor spatial awareness and muscle toes. That stuff is something I can all relate to, my experience with coordination, my spatial awareness, things like that. Dyscalculia is something that can affect a lot of people, and it's difficulties with number concepts and calculations. Dyslexia can, where the difficulties can align for many people is with their reading, writing, spelling, speaking and listening, and sometimes there can be preference for non-linear thinking. And we've got ADHD on here as well. So there can, and I'll break down into the next slides, but there can be the impulsivity and hyperactivity, but where something that could be common misconceptions, and I'll touch that a bit on later on when we talk about people's different experiences, is how they can often show up differently in people. So I know for someone like me, a lot of my hyperactivity and impulsivity can show up as well as like physically to people. It can often be in my mind. That's where insomnia can come in, because my brain is always on overload, always overthinking things. So there's different ways that all these things can show up. And I often say with neurodiversity, it's not a monolith, but it's really important to kind of understand people's different experiences. And then we also have autism and Asperger's on here as well. And that can affect some people's social and communication problems. We can have obsessive interest. That there's a lot of comorbidities, and there's a lot of interlinks with a lot of this when it comes to neurodiversities that can affect other people as well, where there's obsessive interest, can be that real hyper focus and a different way that they might process and think of things when it comes to their imaginative thoughts. And then going into the next slide, I also wanted to highlight many of the positives when it comes to neurodiversity, and many of things I think when people often who are neurodivergent are in safe environments and inclusive environments, they really get to shine. So with ADHD, we often see a lot of people are creative visionaries, non-linear thinkers, can be highly focused. I also say the same with ADHD a lot of the time, that it's often that dopamine interest when it's there. They can be incredibly hyper-focused people, excellent memories. There can be a real attention to detail as well. And that aligns, as I said, with autism, with a lot of the ADHD characteristics as well. often can be natural multitaskers, intuitive, incredibly empathetic as well, big thinkers, can often be highly passionate and motivated, and have really good sense of humour. As I say, a lot of ADHD people, I think I'm often saying, a lot of my friends who have ADHD, I say often social justice warriors. I think they often have, for a lot of neurodivergent people, in fact, are so used to being criticized or have rejection sensitivity disorder. They kind of do not want other people to experience that. So they're really often committed to helping and supporting other people. And a lot of the same characteristics align with dyslexia as well. The real strong visual memory, expressive, outgoing, can often be creative explorers, entrepreneurial, and that often aligns with dyspraxia as well. And why a lot of neurodivergent people tend to be entrepreneurs as well. They often kind of explore different ways. Something's popping up in the text, something about the text. But if it is something, because I did think about that a few minutes before, and I need to make sure that I'm also doing better as well, is quite colourful. So if anything is affecting people's vision, kind of seeing this, I'm happy when I do send the slides over to make sure they're all in plainer text, but I can't see the full message coming up. But I'll definitely take that into account. So I always want to make sure these are inclusive and as readable as possible for people. But I don't know, I can't see the white on pink properly. I'll definitely make a note to edit that as well for people, if that's what I think's being said when I send them out, so people can make sure they read as easily as possible. So please, I'm always open to feedback. So please do any of those feedbacks, send that over to me. I can't see them all in the chat, but I'll definitely make a note to make sure those readable as possible for everyone. And I'm always open. I think this is supposed to be a safe space where everyone talks about their kind of lived experience. And I always say that everyone's an expert on their own lived experience. So I'm always open to feedback. So if it is kind of colourful and too distracting, I'll definitely make an effort to improve that and send it back with cleaner slides so you can see that as well. So I do apologise for that. But I think that's what I caught from what I could see, because it's only showing me a bit of the text in the chat. So I'll go into the next bit, as is ADHD Awareness Month and Black History Month. So there's ADHD Awareness Month, Black History Month, and last week was Dyspraxia Awareness Week. So it's a really, I think, important month to highlight intersectionality and all our different experiences. So this slide goes a bit into what I touched on with ADHD, and the fact that so ADHD, it kind of is a list of behavioral symptoms, and often I think some of the biggest misconceptions is that it affects people's intelligence, but it's not really about affecting intelligence. It's more kind of the way people do things, and those characteristics can have an influence on behavior and support. So there's often three types of kind of ADHD: the more inattentive side, which is things such as kind of distractibility, forgetfulness, losing objects, difficulty regulating attention and focus, more likely to kind of have internalize, maybe more problems listening and difficulties. And then you've got the hyperactive side. So that's where there's some of that impulsivity as well, fidgeting and restlessness, can often complicate people's sentences, difficulties waiting their turn, often could be on the go and difficult to rest in. And then you've got the ADHD that's combined, which I have, which can be a beautiful array and concoction of all these things, and things such as sleeping issues, sensory processing problems. It can often, self-esteem can be impacted as well, and high rate of co-occurring mood disorders and working memory can be impacted. And often it's said that women tend to show up more on the inattentive side, which is why often men are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD often, and women tend to be diagnosed much later in life. And often what I kind of touched on before is it can often present differently in women. So it can often sometimes be the fact that, as I mentioned before, and when I kind of reflect on my own process and diagnosis, in school, I was often kind of seen as a daydreamer. So they can normally be seen more as kind of personal characteristics. So, oh, Abigail, he's worked really hard, she's smart, but she's a daydreamer. She can be a bit forgetful. She can be a bit ditzy. So often it's presented as kind of personal traits and characteristics, as opposed to needing that further support that might often be seen as more obvious in boys and men. So it can often be for in women, in a lot of cases, it can often be different milestones where they may not necessarily get that further support, whether it's at uni or motherhood, those different points where it can kind of all become too much, and women are often so used to internalizing and masking, they can come out of those different points. And for me, I think it kind of came up much later in life where it was like, okay, something needs to be looked into, and that's how I kind of got that further support. So just touched a bit on that there. And then the next slide now is all about, can you explain what ODD is? I think that's talking about reflective. kind of, I think they're referring to OCD. I will confirm there, but I think they're referring to the fact that how some of the comorbidity. So if you're for a lot of people who are neurodivergent, often there's just not one thing they have. It can be OCD. In my case, I have dyspraxia and ADHD. Oh, we're learning all here because I wasn't actually aware of the ODD part. So I think someone's just put it in the chat. But I think there tends to be a lot of some of those comorbidities that come together. So I think that's what is being said there. But yeah, we're all learning together. So I think someone just popped something in the chat that I think would be helpful that I'll definitely take a look at as well. But I think it's touched on here that you're more likely to have co-occurring externalizing disorders that come together if you have one neurodivergent condition. There's often a lot of other things that can come up: anxiety, depression. There's kind of a mix of other things. There's often not just one thing. And then going into the next slides, in terms of creating your inclusive organization and culture. So here are some of the things that I think is important when we're thinking about how we can create more inclusive work environments. Can I still be seen? Everything's still good. I can be seen, right? Brilliant. So what I think is important when we're really talking about creating your inclusive and organizational cultures, some of the things that I think is important is first thinking about accepting all forms of disability and neurodiversity. That's something I often talk about, because I think sometimes when we're learning about things, we can have kind of a linear idea. And I always say I've still got a lot of learning to do when it comes to neurodiversity myself. But I think it's important that we're really accepting all forms. And I always say you can't be neuro-inclusive if you don't accept all forms of neurodiversity. So a lot of us are learning and know about ADHD, autism, and dyslexia, and they're the more commonly known and accepted forms. But I think it's also important that we're learning and talking about things such as Tourette's, OCD, stammers, dyspraxia, Down syndrome, that we're having conversations about all neurodiversity and different ways that people may interpret information or their brains may work to have these conversations. And that we're not kind of thinking about things that may kind of seen as neurotypical presenting, but we're always having an open mind, kindness, and a willingness to change any prejudice that we may hold. And they're always willing to learn. That's why I always say, even sessions like this, I really appreciate the feedback that's already coming in the chat, so we can all do better to create those environments. And that leads into the next point about talking about neurodiversity will improve awareness. So sessions like this, I think, is so important. And one of the biggest barriers to neurodiverse workforce is often a lack of understanding and empathy when it comes to neurodiversity. I think it's really important for employers. And I think something that's been common when I've engaged with a lot of neurodivergent people sometimes, and even the current processes to get an ADHD diagnosis and autistic diagnosis, it can often feel like everything is structured in the way of the barriers or the way I show up, and how that inconveniences people, instead of thinking about what can we do to create environments to kind of help everybody. So I think that's really important, that we're really kind of thinking about reasonable adjustments, and that organizations are doing things like holding sessions like this, engaging with, if you have neurodiversity networks, utilize them, utilize your employer resource groups, get external help in if needed to have these further conversations about creating safe spaces of inclusion, and keep those conversations going so people can feel safe to come in. And I always say a lot of people often do not have the language. They don't know that they're neurodivergent, but if we're having these kind of conversations and people seeing some of these characteristics, that can help create safe environments to have those conversations. And that leads into my next point about, and I've realized I spelled it wrong here, devote and tailor resources. So I think it's important that employers are devoting resources towards efforts that enhance the lives of neurodivergent colleagues. So like I said, don't be afraid to bring in that further help if needed. Always review diversity and inclusion plans to really think about, are we creating the right changes? Think about hiring facilitators that can specialize in making sure that you've got neurodiverse equity and design, and really look at that, like your long-term program and what we're going to do. How can we improve communication styles? How can we dispel myths and really think about misconceptions? So I think that's really important to always think about that. There's great people doing work out there. Lexi is an organisation that does a lot of work with organisation in the workplace. I'm always supporting organisations as well to really make sure they're thinking about that neuro-inclusive long-term culture that they want to create. And then finally, I'd say on this slide is foster inclusive recruiting and hiring. And I think that's really important. The recruitment and interview process can often be the largest barrier to creating neurodiverse workforce. So before a person's even entered a workplace, there can be so many things that can make it hard for people. So I'm always encouraging organisations to really think about that. What can we do to create a welcoming environment for all our neurodivergent employees and anyone from different backgrounds? So I'm always saying, ask all applicants if they need adjustments during the interview process. That's one of the simplest and most important and impactful actions employers can take. Provide as much guidance and information for a candidate prior to an interview, because interviews can be overwhelming processes. And I always say the interviews, it's a two-way street. It's for someone to see if this is the workplace for them, as well as for the organization to see if they wish to hire the person. I always say encourage candidates for their feedback. So regardless of whether they've been hired or not, get their feedback so you can also improve your systems and any potential barriers and opportunities to improve. So even today, I'm really thankful for the feedback I'm getting to make sure I'm improving the work I'm doing here. And I also always say, think about your biases. So as an organization, workplace manager, are you assessing social norms when interviewing? So sometimes things such as a lack of eye contact can be seen as bad, but is that necessarily needed for this specific job? Fidgeting, non-verbal cues, these are all things that you really need to be thinking about. And sometimes there's a neurotypical way of thinking about social interactions, but if that's not critical for the job in hand, really think if that's necessary to kind of bring somebody down in the interview process if they've shown so many strong strengths in many other ways. So I think that's really important. And yeah, I think that leads me into next slides, going a bit further to cover kind of intersectionality as a whole. So intersectionality is another term that I think is really important when we're thinking about creating inclusive work environments and neuro-inclusive work environments. And intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Williams, and she's Williams Crenshaw, and she's an American civil rights advocate, and she's a leading scholar in critical race theory. And intersectionality is basically the idea that there's overlapping, intersecting social identities. And particularly what she was talking about initially was ethnic minorities, identities, experiences. So she was someone who was pivotal in the feminist movement, but thought that Black women's experiences often weren't being highlighted in the feminist movement. And this term is really broadened out to really think about the whole experiences of people and their different identities. So whether that's gender, caste, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, or religion, when we're thinking about different people's experiences, we know that everyone has a unique experience. People are not on monolith, and there's many experiences that make up people's identities. So I have an array of experiences that affect me as a woman, as a Black woman, as a neurodivergent Black woman. When you add that together, there's an array of experiences. And I always say that we all exist, and I exist within multiple minority groups. So I think it's really important to understand intersectionality and making sure that we're really thinking about people's different experiences and the different characteristics they bring. And I think it's really important to understand intersectionality and listen to different ranges of voices and experiences. And that leads a bit into the work I do now that has a real emphasis on, so we can go to the next slide, Joe, thank you so much, that goes into really thinking about different experiences. And my ADHD talk covered this in the last few years. I've been kind of doing a lot of research because I really realized that there's a lot of different experiences that can come up for all people, for women. But I realized that there was quite a unique experience for Black neurodivergent women. So I put these slides together with Unmasked. That is an amazing community group. Ellie Middleton runs it, and she does a lot of work for neurodivergent people. And we had a conversation. She was like, oh, I want to explore and hear a bit more. And I think this perfectly aligns with it being Black History Month and ADHD Awareness Month, to really kind of understand why Black women seem to often be undiagnosed and misdiagnosed, and often the demographic and group that's misdiagnosed the most when it comes to being neurodivergent. So I did some research, and this is some of the kind of many things that came up in different stages of Black women and girls' lives that can often cause some of these reasons that I believe come up. So I'll touch on it briefly. Something that's come up a lot is the adultification of Black girls. So that can often start at a young age. So I touched a bit on about school, and adultification is a bias that is a form of racial prejudice where often children or minority groups are treated more mature than they actually are. So we see this in things such as the prison system and things like this. And a report by an organization called Agenda, they recently did a report that showed that Black girls and boys are 3 times more likely to be expelled from school. And when they looked into some people's experiences, so the group was Black women and often people from the Gypsy Roma traveller community as well, who are often a demographic and group that still face huge amount of discrimination. And actually a group that I often say is often discrimination that is not frowned upon in the way it should be. I think there's still not enough of a taboo, and people still often say a lot of ignorant things about the Gypsy Roma traveller community. So this report kind of focused on those two groups. And when they spoke to a lot of the Black women specific, Black girls specifically, they said that often their experiences was where like non-compliant behavior was seen as like more of a disruption and threat from them compared to their white counterparts. So it was kind of seen that they needed more help, whilst the Black girls often saying in this report that they were seen as more troublesome and weren't getting, and often there was opportunities being missed to support these Black female students. So that adultification was something that kind of often commonly came up when I was interacting and doing research and focusing kind of on early age experiences. And that leads to the next point here about the fear of stigmatization for Black families. So kind of touching on that. So when I did the research, I found out that Black children are 10 times more likely to be referred to CAMHS via social services rather than their own GP. So often it's kind of the idea that things get to the worst stage before Black children often getting the support they need. And often the negative stereotypes and bad experiences can often lead to a distrust of the education and the health system for many Black parents and families. So that can mean that in all intents and purposes, many of this community want to support their children because of that fear of their children being stigmatized as stupid or troublesome, stupid or troublesome. They're sometimes less likely to want to engage in education systems in this way to get them more help because they don't want their children to be stigmatized in the school system. So unintentionally, sometimes struggles can be overlooked in that way. And then something else that's come up in a lot of my research is the twice as hard narrative. And I think this affects a lot of Black children often and people who are generally from immigrant families. So the idea that we're often taught, and that's something I can definitely say I've experienced as a British Ghanaian, often you kind of come to a country and your parents just want you to assimilate, to work hard, to be able to do as well as your white counterparts and colleagues. So sometimes when there's this thinking that you just have to work twice as hard, you just have to work twice as hard. And I think this also affects a lot of women and people generally who are minorities in a workplace or a system. You're often thinking that, and I know I internalize a lot of that shame. I was just thinking, I'm not working hard enough. I'm not working hard enough. And that's why I feel like I'm maybe not doing as well as other people, not necessarily thinking that my brain works differently. And I just need to be able to thrive and work in a different way. So that's something that comes up. And then kind of going into the adulthood of Black women's experiences, some of the things that came up when I was doing my research was Black women's experiences generally in the healthcare system. So there's a lot of research that kind of shows that in the NHS, studies found the evidence of Black women having more negative interactions, kind of more likely to have stereotyping or disrespect, or there being cultural insensitivities when dealing with the health system. And I think this can create a lot of unfortunate experiences. And when I did engage with a lot of Black women, especially ADHD Babes is an amazing community for Black and non-binary, Black women and non-binary people who have ADHD. And when I was kind of doing a lot of the engagement and working with community groups there, a lot of the feedback that was coming up was they were going through so many barriers through their GP to kind of get their assessment, or they're being told, oh, you did well in school, or maybe you sure it's not anxiety or bipolar or something else. Or even if they did have these other things such as anxiety or bipolar, sometimes they would have been exacerbated because they didn't get that original ADHD diagnosis. So it can often be for a lot of Black women, they're really having to advocate and fight for themselves to be taken seriously by doctors. And that leads to my kind of final point with a lot of the research I did was the general expectations that can often be placed on Black women in society. There could be a lot of cultural pressures. Often Black women can be looked at as being strong, kind of the protectors who look after people, the expectation to be domesticated. And this can affect a lot of minority groups when I've engaged with a lot of my Asian friends as well who talk about these things. There's often can be a lot of expectation in women in our societies to kind of be all these things for people that they often feel like they can't necessarily ask for the help they need, or they feel obligated to be strong or not be vulnerable and dependent on others. So it can make it hard to really get that diagnosis and further support they need. So I'm going to try and go through these final slides really quick because I really want to give space for any questions. So the next slide, I'll go on to that. And this just touches on a bit more of what I think organizations can do to make sure that they're always progressing in intersectional equality and agenda. So I always say for any organizations in the workplace, I think it's important to address the demographic makeup in general. So really understand your entire staff and where those intersectional analyses are. So what is the makeup? It's not just how many ethnic minority people in your organization, how many Black women are there, Black men, Asian women, Asian men, how many people are comfortable, and hopefully people are going to be comfortable to disclose their sexuality, their religion, all these different things that make up people and their work experiences. It's really important to assess that data to understand the intersectional analysis, what grades and levels are people at, where people can be seen in the organization. Those things are really, I think, important to assess. I would say it's important to assess and establish clear goals, to have smart objectives about what you're going to do with things, so make sure you're really thinking about that and a timeline on things. I touched on in my last slides about devoting resources and investigate the effects of external action if needed. So if you don't have the resources within your organization to do that, what can you do to get that external support? What can you do to really make sure you're listening and holding spaces for all underrepresented groups and respecting their boundaries and well-being and leading with empathy? I think it's important to always create opportunity for all staff to come together as a group as well. But as I touched on, making sure there's also those times where people can feel safe in their communities to share their experiences as well. I think with all key priorities, it should be led from the top. So make sure you're getting feedback from the marginalized people in your community, but do not rely on them, who are often already dealing with the burdens of how the systems are, to lead on this. It should be people who are the most high who are committed to leading on this work, but making sure you're really taking in their lived experiences and expertise to improve the work as well. And the final point here I'd say is look at the biases. So I've touched on that in your recruiting, hiring and talent management, and really focus on that talent pipeline as well. So as well as bringing people into organizations, think about the people who've been there for an amazing amount of time doing work and what you can do to promote and support them as well. And then I'll just go into the next slide, because this is something that I saw online that really just definitely I could relate to. And it's the idea that undiagnosed neurodivergent is like being handed a video game. So that's been set to really hard mode, but having people tell you over and over, it's easy, why do you keep on dying? And diagnosis is learning the game is on hard mode. It doesn't make it easier, but you can strategize. And that's something I can really relate to, because I always say that getting my ADHD diagnosis, I feel like has made me kinder to myself, more compassionate, and realize that there's just different ways. I'm not stupid. There's just different ways I need to learn, and that's okay. It's okay for me to learn and to do things in a different way. We all kind of have different routes to the same destination, but I just need to strategize and do things that work for me. So I think that's something that always stays with me, that statement. And I'll just go into the next slide that leads into how we can really make sure we're supporting neurodivergent employees and those with disabilities. So I always say this is something I think is especially important for all managers and organizations. But if a colleague has asked for help, I always encourage people to really reiterate how that's good that they're asking for help and make them feel as comfortable as possible. Like I said earlier, people don't often always have the language. So for a long time, I didn't know that I was neurodivergent. I just knew that there was different ways that I needed help, and I really had to kind of write that down and assess what ways work for me. And I think that's important. I think always as a manager, you should always start with highlighting their areas of strength and then kind of lead into a discussion with them where they might need further support and workplace adjustments, and how you go about supporting them and really understanding what their personal preferences are. And when I go into my next slide, I'll kind of show something that I use for my teams as a good kind of starting point. I would say listen empathetically and validate their experiences without judgment. And I always encourage managers and teams to do your own research as well. Often people don't know what help they need, or people might have found out about diagnosis recently, but the onus shouldn't be all on them just to do that work. Do your research to understand as well. And I also say as a manager, it's important to respect confidentiality. So if somebody is not comfortable in their journey with sharing with other people, of course we want to create neurodivergent and neuro-inclusive environments where people are comfortable. But if they're not, it's important not to disclose that without their knowledge. And then my next slide just goes into something that I encourage people to use. So it's a personal preference and workplace adjustment kind of toolkit that I use. And I think it's just always, for anyone new to a team, it's a good start. I always encourage everyone in my team to use these and share with each other. And I think it's an important starting point when people don't kind of know what support they need, just to kind of understand conditions that people like to work in, the times and hours they like to work, the best ways to communicate with me, the ways I like to receive feedback, because that could be hard for people, the things I may need in this role, the things I struggle with, the things I love, and other things to know about me. And I think that's always a good starting point when someone joins my team. I kind of use this and then talk through it with them. And I also share mine. So there's that comfortability that we're all kind of sharing the ways we work, and we all can have a better understanding of each other. So that's something that I aim to do. Can you still see me? Sorry, someone's calling me in the background. So hopefully that's not affected me, has it? Oh, I'm still here. Oh, okay, great. And then my final two slides. So the next one is some suggested accommodations for executive functions. So this is some stuff I use. Sorry, someone keeps on calling me. Oh, okay, hopefully. I'm still here, right? Brilliant. So some of the suggested functions that I use that have been really helpful for me in my career, stuff like setting reminders ahead of meetings or tasks, being really specific with instructions and deadlines I need as well. I think that can be something that can often be hard for people as well. So for me, I like to make sure it's really clear. If you're given instructions, I need this completed for 4 p.m. So because close of play can be misconstrued for many people. I like to use checklists, diaries, and calendars and a day-to-day planner to structure my day. I often like to block my calendar color coded because that helps me. Having large multiple screens is often very helpful for me as well. So I have a larger screen to kind of be able to look at the different things I need. I think it's really important to break down tasks into clear bite-sized steps as well. And in my team, I always, when I bring someone new in, provide best case examples and templates where possible for people. It's always helpful for me to follow up verbal instructions with written instructions as well. And I also say, do not always view lateness or as necessarily poor attitude. Sometimes people can be overwhelmed. So where you can help with people's work structures and days, please do. And always aim to feed in regular breaks as well. And I think that's some of my most of my slides. My final one is just some takeaways, just for anyone on this process of trying to create neuro-inclusive organizations. I would say take the time to understand, to talk and listen to your colleagues so you can understand who they really are and who you perceive them to be. Always can be compassionate and listen to hear what colleagues are saying, as opposed to just listen and telling them what you think. Be honest and transparent. Be ready to own up to your mistakes. I've made some mistakes on here and people have really been helpful for me to take that feedback in and make sure you're always aiming and doing it. You aim and have a commitment to want to do better as well. And make sure that you're not treating any of this work as just like flavor of the month or something that's popular now, because it's really important to improve everyone's experiences in the workplace as well. And I always say it's not a marathon, it's a sprint. So pace yourself, and that is really making sure you're able to make the sustained effort of change needed. So that's it from me. The last slides are just some of the things you can find from me. So my TedX on YouTube about Black women's experiences with ADHD. I also often talk about neurodiversity and intersectionality on LinkedIn as well. And I'm happy to share in the link the diagnosis pathway for ADHD. There's many different pathways. So I think it's always important, and that can apply to all kind of neurodivergent kind of diagnosis. There's often a different process for all of them. So that information is really helpful in ADHD UK. And yeah, happy to take any questions. We'll definitely share the slides and make sure that if you can get me any of the feedback on the chat, Joe, but I think it was more from what I could catch. I think the colourful slides were maybe a bit distracting. So I'm happy to have them all on plain white slides. If needed, I can adjust that. And I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Abigail. That was fantastic. Lots of great information in there, and done with such composure and poise, considering the tech issues at the beginning of the session.
Well, thank you for being so patient.
Very welcome. There is lots of questions already coming into the chat. I'm going to say one thing. We will share the slides that Abigail sent, as she just said. She'll do another version without the colours for people with that feedback.
Yeah, if there's a way for me to get I can see the chat now, but if there's a way for me to just get a copy of all the chat, I will make sure I take all the feedback to improve and send anything over.
For sure, I can send you the points out of the chat. Somebody else has asked if I can share the chat more widely, which I can't due to data protection issues. But what I will do is I'll keep the call going at the end of the session. If you want to stay and copy and paste what you need out of the chat, then it's absolutely fine for you to do that as well. Okay, I'm going to go to the questions that were in the chat first. I can see Bryony has got a hand up, so I'll come to you. Be patient, Bryony, I'll come to you in a moment. There was lots of questions around lots of questions and comments around the whole interview process. I can see that's obviously raised a lot of interest for people that are on the call. And there was a call about language, a question about language. So I'm going to start with that one. A lot of chats, and bear with me, I'm just going to get back to the very first question that was around how important it was in the language that we use when we're talking about neurodiversity. And did you have any recommendations on the type of language to use? Someone has been looking for government, gov.uk, government gateway guidelines, and can't find anything around the type of language we should be using. Have you got
Okay,
any?
I can definitely find some stuff. I know that there's things such as, I know civil service, a lot of organizations kind of do the guaranteed interview scheme, where if you meet those kind of expected requirements at that level, you are entitled to come to the interview stage, so you can tick something there. I think it's just always important to explain the fact that you are an inclusive environment. We want people from all backgrounds. If your data shows stuff like that, you do not have a diverse range of ethnic minority people or neuro-inclusive people, I think it's just always a simple line of encouraging that we really want to make sure our organization is more reflective of our community. So we really appreciate seeing more applicants who are neurodivergent, who are from ethnic minority background, who are from a certain religion, whatever you are realizing in your data. And that's why I say it's always important to kind of really do that data at first, what you're kind of lacking in your organization, or even if you don't have the stats, why people aren't feeling safe to disclose it. I think it's important to put that line to say, we want to kind of do better. Because I think that line, I know, has been convincing to me when I've seen that, okay, this organization actually wants to see someone who looks like me. So I think that line's helpful. And then really thinking about, yeah, I've seen definitely great inclusive organizations who have had kind of a real breakdown of what they're committed to doing. I personally, I know not everyone's keen on it, but I don't think interviews should feel like a real test. So I think where you can at least give as much information about what the questions are going to include. I've had interviews where people have actually given some of the questions beforehand, and I think that's been really helpful. So as much information as possible, really trying to give people enough time to prepare. I've seen interviews where there's, to me, it's way too short to give people the real time to prepare. Really asking people what they need, what we can do. If someone needs more time to present and stuff, give them that space. I think it should really always feel like it's beneficial relationship for both. But yeah, I think, yeah, some of that language is letting people know that you're open to having people from all types of backgrounds, and we want to create more inclusive environments, I think does a world of good.
And around the interview process, there was lots of comments in the chat as well around people that have been given the questions an hour in advance, and that's been really helpful. And also from others sharing how questions on virtual interviews were being put into the chat, and that was helpful.
Yeah. That is something that I always ask for. Yes, so thank you. All reminded me of stuff that I find really helpful. Yes, I think when you're, especially someone who has ADHD, I can go in tangents and storytellers, and one thing can throw me off. So I think where you've kind of just got that point to bring yourself back and see the question in the chat to bring you back is really helpful. So yeah, these are all really good ideas. Yeah, something I'm really keen on. As early as possible, that you can kind of give people the questions or a real clear idea of what's going to be covered. Because yeah, I think there can be a lot of presuming in the interview process, and I don't think that should be the aim. Everything should be broken down well, where you can pop those questions in the chat to help remind people of what the question is. I think is really helpful. And yeah, not like interviewers shouldn't be afraid to repeat, to like all those things. It should be a comfortable and safe conversation.
Yeah. And what about the application process? Because there was a lot of comments about there's more support being offered in the interview, but actually people can find the writing of the application really stressful and difficult as well. Do you have any suggestions or advice for that?
I think there should be definitely different interactive ways. I saw an interview, one was really good recently, where it was kind of answering the questions written down, but you could also kind of do a video for certain questions if you feel like that you shine better in that way. I thought that was really good. I think there should be a space to kind of speak to somebody beforehand. I know that can be hard, but I think if there is something that people would rather have a brief virtual pre-chat for, I think there should always be that space to break things down as well. So I think that should, and I think, yeah, job description should be really clear as well. I think there should be as much information for people. I was vocal about that. Job description, pay, all this information to prepare people adequately as much as possible before going into an interview.
And would you encourage people, if it's not written on the application form, to just reach out to job holders and ask them for more support?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think don't be afraid to kind of, and that's a good test for you as well when people are trying to sift out if people aren't as engaging, or you're feeling like this isn't an environment where they're willing to kind of help in those early stages, and that's probably not the best place for you. So I think, yeah, never be afraid to reach out.
Great. And can you reach out if you haven't had a diagnosis, but you are in the process, or it's something that you think you have?
Yes, so something I didn't touch on there, but I wanted to, is I always say that I think self-diagnosis is valid. I think part of the reason that I was able to get my official diagnosis is because I I kind of did that research, and I kind of wrote down everything that I think had affected me in my childhood leading up to my adulthood, that made me think that I aligned with ADHD, and the kind of some of the diagnosis symptoms that hit those indicators. So I would say that unfortunately we are in a system right now where the NHS is under extreme pressure. There's long waiting lists. Not everybody has the resources to get to pay for their diagnosis. I went through, which is covering the diagnosis pathways, right to choose. So that was through the NHS, but that was because I'd been waiting for such a while. You could kind of go through this process where you basically say, I'd want this specific provider to kind of deal with my case, but that still took a while. So I think there's a lot happening right now, and a lot needing to be changed with the system. That means that not everyone can get that official diagnosis, but if you align, you've kind of done that research and you align with that condition, I think it's okay to say this is what I believe I align with. I'm currently trying to go through the process, but this is still the support I need, because we should be creating neuro-inclusive environments and understanding that not everybody is going to be lucky enough to kind of have that piece of paper or that official diagnosis.
Right. And on the subject of diagnosis, there's a few more questions that are in the chat around. One is around, do you have any advice on how to speak to people about an ADHD diagnosis when the person that you're talking to doesn't think you have it, or thinks that ADHD is a new and fashionable thing and doesn't necessarily understand the diagnosis and sees it as a different type of personality? And then there's another question that you might want to pick up at the same time, which is around having conversations about neurodiversity with your line manager and colleagues as well, and that there's often people don't feel able to do that because there's a stigma attached to it. What do you think?
I totally understand. And unfortunately, I'm very vocal about how there's been a lot of ableism, and the media unfortunately had a huge hand at that recently, with a lot of kind of negative information out there, and this kind of idea that it's a fad, and I'm always vocal about how it's not a fad. It is, as with anything, people learning about something more, and it's now being able to help more people because there's conversations, there's research. But I think unfortunately, yes, when people are learning more about something, people kind of presume that this is a fad, but it's not a fad. It's something that's affected people for many years. So something I always say is, I don't think it's for anybody who doesn't have kind of has done the research or learning to make any assumptions, especially the manager. Your job is to kind of help and create an environment where your team can thrive. So if somebody's telling you that they need more help and support, it's your job to give them that further support. So if you do have anything at first point of contact, like kind of occupational health or anything further, workplace adjustments, like a kind of team in your workplace, I always say don't be kind of afraid to go to them, or let your manager know that you kind of do need that further support. Even something as a lot of organizations have like a workplace passport, which kind of gives you a chance to write down the support you need and be able to kind of take that where you need within your organization. So I think that's really important. But that's why I always kind of encourage at first point of call that personal preference and workplace adjustment tool that I use, because I think it is a place where you should be able to kind of write down how you work, the best ways to work, the kind of thinking about things you struggle with, and then that's where kind of a manager can really think about what support can we get you, or who can we bring in to give you further support. So I think that's what I was kind of encouraged. And I think also, if you do have things like employee networks and stuff, they're always good as a starting point. That's something I've often encouraged in my organization as well. Let's utilize them. Let's bring them in to help facilitate those conversations in the workplace, because it can also be challenging for someone to have to lead in that conversation. But yeah, I would say don't be afraid to kind of write these things down. Don't be afraid to really utilize some of these different ways. So whether it's these suggested accommodations for executive functions that I've put down to kind of help to present, to say, this is what helps me. So if you don't feel like you're in an environment where someone, they're not comfortable with the words or whatever reasons, make sure it's okay to focus on, okay, what help do I individually need? And let's focus on that and helping them get an understanding of that.
And we've also got some mixed experiences in the chat as well, from having with diagnosis and conversations in the workplace, and there's some positive experiences in there as well, from people having occupational health reports and that kind of support that are positive in there too. What about generally about language that you would use around neurodiversity. There's a question about, are there any standards, or is there any government guidelines? I think that's a question around how we talk about people that are neurodiverse from people that aren't neurodiverse.
Well, I would say it's just, I always say people aren't a monolith, so people might have different experiences and what they're comfortable with. I think it's just important to understand that, yeah, what neurodiversity is, which I've touched on, neurodivergent, and even things like conditions. Some people aren't even comfortable with that. People like, they won't necessarily want it to be referred to as a condition. So I always say it's important to speak to people individually, but I think it's just important to understand the term of being neurodivergent, what it is. I would say, well, it's about creating neuro-inclusive working environment. So I think it's okay to speak individually to understand people's experiences, but I think it's okay to talk about neurodiversity as a whole, and being neurodivergent, supporting neurodivergent people. So yeah, there's some of the terms I would use, but if there's anything individually that people want to know more about, yeah, I'm happy to think about further about that. But I think it's important to ask people individually what they want. There's definitely a lot of good things from a civil service perspective. There's a really good toolkit. They have it focuses on dyspraxia and dyslexia, but it's actually, I think, applicable to all people who are neurodivergent. So I'll definitely share that, because it has a really lot of good tools about supporting people with their organization, with their planning, the point of call where you might need to get help and stuff. So I'm happy to definitely pop that in the chat. I can find the link, but it's from the Dyspraxia and Dyslexia Network, and it's a civil service toolkit, so that's really helpful.
Thank you, Abigail. We are very close to running out of our time, and there are so many comments and questions in the chat. I think it's one of the busiest chats that I've seen on one of these sessions. I can't keep up with all the comments and questions that are flying by. But what I'll do is I'll make sure that I share the chat with you, Abigail, and then maybe we can work together to do a follow-up article of some kind. And
yes, that sounds brilliant.
the people, and make sure that all of those questions and comments that you put in the chat we can reflect on and send out some follow-up information, because it's obviously a topic that people are really, really interested in, and for good reason as well. Is there anything final that you wanted to say, Abigail?
All I would say is that we're all learning. I'd always say, especially anyone who's neurodivergent or thinks they may be neurodivergent, just be kind to yourself. I think often a lot of neurodivergent people can be really self-critical and harsh on themselves. Be kind. Do not see it as a negative thing. Your brain works differently, but there's so many amazing positive characteristics. So yeah, be kind to yourself and focus on the strategies and the ways that work for you. Don't feel like you have to work the way that other people tell you to work. Find the ways and strategies that work best for you. I know that there's a community out there. There's a huge community of support out there.
Fantastic. And we are going to send out the video from this session so people can watch that back. We'll send out some links, some useful links that you think, and we'll send up some follow-up information as well. So a massive, massive thank you, Abigail. I know Abigail is actually doing this Zoom call today from Ghana, where she just had a wedding on Saturday. So it's been an incredibly busy time for you over these past few days, and you still managed to fit this in because it's such an important topic for you. So
I'm happy to be here. Thank you all. I'm sorry for the technical problems at the beginning, but yes, I'm definitely happy to look at all the amazing feedback in the comments, and make sure I get those slides out to everyone in the most accessible and readable ways possible.
We got there in the end. Fantastic. Okay, so we thank you to Abigail, but thank you more importantly to all of you for giving us an hour out of, I know, your very busy days to come to one of our sessions. We have another couple of sessions coming up in the next few weeks. Our session in November is going to be around menopause. So also Menopause Awareness Month in October, lots of awareness months happening in October, and we are going to be looking at how to create a supportive workplace around menopause. So that's going to take place on the 2nd of November. So check out our events page. It is www.thresholds.co.uk. Go to the event page, and that is where you can sign up to all of our free events. And you'll also see some of our workshops and details about our programme as well, should you want any more information. So thank you so much for attending today, and we hope to see you at a session in the future. if anyone needs to have anything out of the chat, I'll keep the session open. If you want to copy any of those links or anything out, then feel free to stay and do that. Otherwise, have a great day, and we will hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you all. And yeah, I'll get a note of the chat and send anything back over as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Abigail. Bye.
Bye.